Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today at the International Workshop on HIV in Women 2022. As many of you know, I've been spending a lot of time on emerging viruses in the recent years, but really where my heart lies is HIV and AIDS. So thank you for having me, and thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. Today's topic is going to be COVID-19 vaccines. Where do we stand and where are we headed? These are my disclosures. And I wanted to start the talk with a reflection on the 2-year anniversary that we have just celebrated, 2 years of pandemic. And when we look back to our own country here in Germany, the first COVID patient was identified in Munich by one of our colleagues from the HIV field. Dr. Camilla Rothe is a dedicated clinician and a researcher dedicated to the cause of HIV in women in Africa. And she was the first to identify the beginning of our pandemic. And she was therefore also named as one of the 100 most influential people of 2020 by Time magazine. So where do we stand now? The world, 2 years later, we have about 80 million cases and we're approaching the million death number. Germany is sadly number 3 in disease activity. But what we have now, what we didn't have in 2020 is vaccines. And this is what we're going to spend 18 minutes on reflecting upon. So when we think about COVID-19, it's an era of incredible research activity. And I've pulled up 2 screenshots from PubMed. If you look at what has been published over 20 years of research, about 100,000 results hit in PubMed. And if you compare that to COVID-19 as a term, there are 240, like double that amount, in just a few years, just 2 years, which is incredible. So there is an enormous body of very dynamic data that has emerged also on COVID-19 vaccines. So when you actually Google COVID vaccines, you get about 1 billion results in less than a second. So this is really, I compare it to a field of flowers, a lot of beautiful flowers, but also a lot of weed. But in the short time that we have, I'll be able just to pick a couple of flowers for you, and I hope we'll have a bouquet that everybody can take something away from. I would like to start with just the fact and celebrating the fact that the development of COVID-19 vaccines has really been so dramatically fast. This is a timeline, and there are other publications who have shown this similarly, and I'll just mark up there. It's only been 3 months from the detection of a new pathogen to the first in human clinical trials. And this is incredible and will have an impact on future vaccine development also for other diseases. So the question that kind of comes up in the practice a lot, and oftentimes that's associated with concerns about safety, it's why did it go so fast? So I just wanted to kind of spend a moment on thinking about that again. So it's not that we started in 2020 or 2019. The vaccine development really built on rich data sets that came from other coronaviruses like MERS or SARS, and also built on basic research that was started in the 60s, like RNA technology. And it also was a known virus family, so it was not a completely new pathogen. In the years leading up to this vaccine development through Ebola as well, like technological progress was quite astounding, and there were platform technologies available. And if you look here, it only took 4 days from sequence availability to GMP production of a new IMP, which is really dramatic. I mentioned there were existing platforms, and I'm just using this example of RNA technology. In the process of vaccine development in the recent years, there was an accelerated review process, and regulatory processes also were shortened. And in the clinical trials, the phases were overlapping, and companies and developers really took an accepted financial risk to move the products forward. And lastly, there was worldwide cooperation and really early funding that made all of this possible. This is still one of my favorite go-to review articles on COVID-19 vaccine strategies by Florian Krammer. And if you're really interested, you should also follow him on Twitter and YouTube. Like we see here, the SARS-CoV-2, like a representation of SARS-CoV-2, and all of the licensed products at this point in time use as an antigen either the entire spike protein, so the little thing that sticks up from the surface, or the RBD, the receptor binding domain. And in terms of how this is delivered, there are really three strategies that are on the forefront of the licensed vaccines. We have here the RNA vaccines, we'll come to that, then replication competent vector vaccines, such as the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Janssen vaccine, and also more of the newer generation recombinant spike protein-based vaccines. But what we tend to forget sometimes that there are still today in 2022 multiple vaccine candidates in all stages of clinical development. And this is a figure that is taken from the New York Times vaccine tracker, which is a really nice way of looking at summarizing what's going on in the world. And as you can see, there are still 119 vaccines in clinical trials, and close to 50 have reached phase 2 and 3 final stages of testing. And beyond that, there are still 75 preclinical vaccines that haven't even made it to clinical trials yet under active investigation. So it's a really rich pipeline that will also produce second and third generation vaccines should we need them. More other trackers that you can refer to, I just want to point out, obviously, if you want a very systematic approach to what's out there in the vaccine landscape, there's the WHO draft landscape, and then also the London School of Tropical Medicine has a really good overview. When you go to the WHO COVID vaccine tracker, it leads you to a website where you can actually download an Excel file where you can really delve into what's available, what are the different approaches, what clinical trials are ongoing, and it has clinical and preclinical, so go wild. Back to the representation of the New York Times vaccine tracker, I think it also gives a nice overview about the different vaccines that are administered worldwide. So we oftentimes focus on the 3 or 5 or 4 vaccines that are licensed in our countries or in our region, but within the world, there's really a broad spectrum of vaccines that is authorized in certain countries, and you will come across those, especially when, with the benefits that people have received or are linked to full vaccination. You will kind of likely see Sinovac or Sinopharm or some other vaccines. And so it's helpful to be familiar with those as well. These are the 5 that are the most used or the ones that I licensed in Europe. And I have summarized that here with a screenshot from the EMA website. So authorized for use in the European Union, we have Comirnaty, the mRNA vaccine from BioNTech and Pfizer, Nuvaxovid from Novavax protein, recombinant protein vaccine, Spikevax by Moderna, RNA vaccine, Vaxzevria, AstraZeneca, a vector vaccine, and COVID-19 vaccine from Janssen, also a vector vaccine. Sanofi Pasteur has just submitted a marketing authorization application for Vitpreftin, another vaccine that we should look out to. And there are 4 additional vaccines in the pipeline at the EMA for rolling review, and those include Sputnik, then a vaccine that's called Hipra. Sinovac has been applied for current rolling review, and also Valneva. But also many areas of research and our life are touched by the tragic conflict in Ukraine, and so also the vaccine review of Sputnik is caught up in the sanctions that are ongoing at this point in time. So for the remainder of the talk, I would just like to kind of pick a couple of flowers that are the aspects that are most relevant maybe to our practice or that are heavily discussed or you might encounter. So would like to go a little bit back to the beginnings and discuss what the vaccines really were licensed for, talk about booster vaccinations, a little bit about heterologous vaccination, efficacy against the variants, and some other fun facts. So let's start with going back to the beginning. So this is the first licensed vaccine by BioNTech and Pfizer. And really, what I hear in my practice oftentimes is the vaccines don't work anymore. But, when you look back at the licensing studies of all of our licensed vaccines, they were never licensed to block transmission. They were authorized to reduce symptomatic COVID-19. And that's why you always had not only infections, but symptomatic infections or severe infections also in the vaccine arms. And I think sometimes in our practice, it's important to remind our patients of that because they come and say oh, I just got Omicron, so the vaccines are not working. So they're working well, they're still working well, they're protecting against symptomatic COVID and severe COVID, and even in the face of the variants. And that holds true for all of the vaccine that we have available, as you can see here, symptomatic COVID. And sometimes I feel it's important to kind of remind ourselves about that. So after the initial primary regimens, we've then introduced the first booster vaccinations, and really this has increased vaccine effectiveness against severe disease and death. And these are data from Israel, where you can see how the different outcomes, 2 doses against 3 doses, have really made a difference. This is data on over 700,000 individuals per group, the median age of 52 and 50% of female participants. And the effectiveness against admission to hospital was 93%, severe disease 92%, and death 81%. So obviously we have a changing cadre of variants, and this was not in the face of Omicron, but there is a benefit of booster vaccinations. We've also learned a lot about the different vaccines that we have, and we learned that mixing and matching of vaccines is safe and immunogenic. This is just an exemplary study in the context of booster vaccinations, but that really holds true for the primary immunization schedules as well, that it is safe to kind of combine vaccines in our vaccination strategies. There are certain vaccination strategies that are probably not as successful in getting good immunogenicity, but in general, this makes it easier in our day-to-day life to move forward with designing new strategies going forward. There is an ongoing debate in the world about the 4th vaccination, and I'm not going through this article with you in great detail, but I found this BMG article helpful to kind of reflect upon 4th vaccination doses or second booster vaccine, who needs them and why. And the New York Times also had an active discussion around this topic. So there are still a lot of unanswered questions, but there are also emerging data that support one or the other. I think in the setting of immunocompromised hosts, there's a lot of agreement that this is the way to go forward. But so for other age groups or groups, the data is still emerging. This is data from Israel as well, where 400,000 adults aged 60 and older had the 4th dose versus 600,000 aged 60 and older with a 3rd dose. And what this study showed that the 4th dose raised the protection against infection by up to 2 times and raised the protection against severe illness by up to 3 times. So in the older age group, there is emerging evidence for additional benefit. And this is also the group that is at high risk for severe disease courses. So most countries have incorporated this, say, after 50, 60, or 70 years to recommend a 4th dose. More recent data that was published in the New England Journal also looked at healthcare workers in a younger age group. There, they also found that a 4th vaccine dose or a second booster is safe and immunogenic. And you can see this up here. This is data that looks at live neutralization efficacy. And you see different viruses, wild type, in black, Delta in yellow, and Omicron in red. And as you can see, 1 week after the fourth dose, there's nice increase of neutralizing antibodies also against Omicron, and that it persists and it actually gets a little higher also after the second dose. And this holds true if you're boosting with either BioNTech vaccine Comirnaty or with Spikevax. When it comes to vaccine efficacy, like there had been still a lot of transmission in these healthcare workers, and these individuals also had high viral loads, suggesting that even though fourth vaccinated were infectious. So this article raises the question that maybe in younger and healthier age groups, the benefits of this fourth vaccine dose is more marginal. So we need a little further data to discuss the way forward, but that's some of the data that's out there at this point in time. So another issue that often comes up, and that like long COVID is probably a problem that will be with us for quite some time in the aftermath of the pandemic, although we're still in the middle of the pandemic. But there's now the first data emerging that vaccines also impact or reduce long COVID symptoms. And this is also data from Israel, where they looked at close to 1,000 infected and 2,400 uninfected individuals, and really found that in this population, when they looked at the most commonly reported symptoms of post-acute COVID, fatigue, headache, weakness, and muscle pain, there was a reduction of 50 to 68% of less long COVID symptoms, which is also promising if we kind of entertain our counseling sessions with the people to be vaccinated. One last point that I wanted to raise, it's also data that has been emerging from vaccination of pregnant women. So in infants of vaccinated women, we see durable antibody responses in infants that were born to vaccinated mothers compared to infants that were actually infected themselves. There, as you can see at month 6, persistence of antibodies is not as high. These are initial data, and we need some more to kind of get a better picture, but these benefits also lead to protection in the offspring of vaccinated individuals, and that's also very promising. So when we talk about COVID-19 vaccines, we also have to look beyond our own borders. And as you can see, not surprisingly, because we've known this in the HIV field as well, that there's inequitable distribution of these vaccines in the world. So and when we look at the least wealthy 50 places in the world, have only 8% of the vaccinations, while they have over 20% of the world's population. So there's a discrepancy and a disbalance there. And the countries and regions with the highest income are getting vaccinated more than 10 times faster than those with the lowest. Sounds familiar to people working in the HIV field, and we really have to work on that. This is a little bit the mission of COVAX, an initiative that's put forward by UNICEF, Gavi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and the World Health Organization, where we're really working for global equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines is at the forefront. So we're so connected in the world, and the mission of COVAX is no one is safe unless everyone is safe. So we really have to commit to global equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. So where are we headed? We're now luckily have the first generation of COVID vaccines, but there are a lot of efforts working towards universal vaccines or universal coronavirus vaccines and new vaccination strategies. And I just put a screenshot from one of the recent WHO consultations on COVID vaccines, which you can also go to and look, and you see all the slides and all the presentations. It's really exciting what is moving forward there. There will be additional antigens besides the spike that are going to be introduced into those vaccines. There are nanoparticle-based vaccines with multiple spike proteins and different approaches to enhance immunogenicity for coronaviruses, but also beyond that. So I think application will play a role. How can we enhance immunity on mucosal surfaces? So all these questions are being raised and worked upon. So just for those who like to listen to podcasts, this topic has also been recently taken up in March by Eric Rubin and Lindsay Baden. Universal, can we make more effective COVID-19 vaccines? So it's something I recommend when you are on your walk or your jog. It gives a really nice overview. So where are we headed in the future? Moderna as a company has just pledged vaccine plans for the 15 priority pathogens. And so I think the years to come might lead to astounding new progress. Although one also has to say, like, having a new technology does not kind of solve all the problems that we had with vaccine development for certain indications such as malaria, but also HIV. So I think it's going to be exciting to have those tools, but some of the challenges and barriers we will probably still have to deal with. So with that, I'm coming to the end, and my take-home message is really to kind of celebrate that it took less than a year to develop and license a vaccine against a novel pathogen. In less than 2 years, 5 safe and effective vaccines were licensed in the EU. And even in the face of like really highly transmissible viral variants such as Omicron BA1 and BA2, which is ravaging through Europe at this point in time, there's still good efficacy against severe illness, hospitalization, and death. And like with all of these vaccines, the ones that we have and that there are those that are to come, we need to make sure that we ensure equitable access of those vaccines in the world and that they're equitably distributed. My motto is every shot counts. So like even at this point in time, it's really more difficult to convince people to get vaccinated, but every shot counts. And in the meantime, I think we all have to try to keep calm and carry on. We would have liked to be out of this pandemic by this time in our lives, but we're still dealing with it, but we will kind of emerge on at the end. So I'm very confident about that. So with that, I thank you for your attention and stay healthy. And I'm looking forward to this discussion later on. Thanks for having me.